The Ashford bloodline does not accept weeds. Those were the last words Miriam Ashford uttered before pressing a scorching metal pen into her daughter-in-law's wrist. Celeste gasped, the searing heat leaving a permanent mark on her skin as she fought to keep her balance. Miriam's eyes held no mercy, only the cold intent to leave a scar that would remind Celeste of her place forever. Celeste clenched her teeth, swallowing her scream, but Miriam didn't know one thing. Her son, the most feared Mafia king in Chicago, was standing right behind her, and he had witnessed everything. For 33 years, Knox Ashford had never once confronted his mother. But that night, his gray eyes turned colder than ever. He lifted his phone and spoke only 2 words, Protocol 0, a protocol reserved only for the highest-level traitors. And for the first time in Ashford family history, it was activated for the mother herself. This is the story of an orphan chef who stepped into the underworld, of a mafia boss forced to choose between blood and love, and of a revenge that burned an empire from within. To understand why that night happened, we must go back 20 months to the night Celeste Morgan first saw Knox Ashford walk into her restaurant. If you want to see how Miriam paid for her sins, stay until the very end. Hit like and share if you believe justice spares no one. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss stories even more intense than this one. 14 months before that fateful night, Chicago was sinking into the cold of February. Wind off Lake Michigan swept through the empty streets, carrying an icy bite sharp enough to cut through skin and bone. Midnight Harbor sat in the most luxurious part of the city, where a single dinner cost as much as a working person's entire month of wages. And Celeste Morgan, 27 years old, was standing in that restaurant's sweltering kitchen, sweat sliding down the length of her spine, even while the world outside was frozen solid. She was the night shift sous chef, the one who arrived earliest and left latest, the one who did the jobs nobody else wanted to do. But Celeste didn't complain. She had grown used to living without choices a very long time ago. 15 years earlier, when she was only 12, Celeste had stood at the gates of an orphanage in Detroit with a torn backpack and eyes so dry they held no tears at all. She didn't cry when her parents died in a car accident. She didn't cry when they took her into the orphanage. She learned that tears didn't change anything. Only hands willing to work and a will strong enough to endure could keep her alive. In the orphanage, Celeste taught herself how to cook from old books in the library and videos on a shared computer with half its keys broken. She cooked from leftovers, from cheap ingredients the orphanage kitchen threw away, and she cooked for Drew, the frail 7-year-old boy she met on her first day there. Drew had been born with a heart condition, was sick often, and nobody wanted to adopt a child who carried illness like a shadow over his life. Celeste became his sister, his protector, the only person he had. Now, 15 years later, Drew was 22 and lying in a hospital bed waiting for heart surgery that Celeste couldn't afford to pay for. $47,000. That number pressed down on her shoulders like a mountain every single day. That was why she worked 14 hours a day, 6 days a week, with no vacation, no complaints. That night, everything began to change when Midnight Harbor's head chef called in sick. The restaurant manager looked at Celeste with open doubt, then told her she would have to go out and take a special order from a VIP guest. Celeste nodded even though worry tightened inside her. She was used to staying in the kitchen, not facing wealthy, arrogant customers. When she stepped through the kitchen door, the restaurant was almost completely empty. It was 11 o'clock at night, and most of the diners had already gone home. Only one man remained, seated in the darkest corner of the restaurant, where the chandelier light couldn't quite reach. He sat alone, with no entourage and no companion. That was strange in a place like Midnight Harbor, where people came to show off and to be seen. This man seemed to want to disappear into the shadows. Celeste walked toward him, trying to keep her voice professional even as her heart beat faster than usual. But before she could speak, a drunken guest from a nearby table rose unsteadily and staggered toward her. He grabbed Celeste by the wrist, his breath thick with alcohol, and said vulgar things she didn't want to remember. Celeste tried to pull free, but he was too strong. She was about to cry out for security when everything stopped. The man in the dark corner stood up. He didn't say a single word. He simply rose and walked toward them. The drunk turned around, perhaps ready to shout, but the moment he saw the man's face, he went pale as though he had just looked death in the eye. He released Celeste's wrist, stammered something meaningless, then all but ran out of the restaurant. The mysterious man didn't chase him and didn't speak. He only returned to his table and sat down as though nothing had happened. Celeste stood there for a moment, her heart still pounding hard against her ribs. Then she walked to his table, dipped her head slightly, and thanked him. The man only nodded, his gray eyes resting on her with something Celeste couldn't read. It wasn't pity. It wasn't contempt. It was only pure observation, as though he were assessing her. Then he spoke, his voice low and even like water moving over stone. "Cook one dish for me. Your choice. No menu." Celeste was startled. In all 3 years she had worked there, nobody had ever asked for that. Midnight Harbor's guests always ordered the most expensive dishes to prove they could pay for them. Nobody cared what the chef wanted to cook. She looked into those cold gray eyes, and for reasons she couldn't understand, she nodded. Celeste didn't know that the man who had just saved her was named Knox Ashford, the most powerful Mafia boss in Chicago, a man whose name alone was enough to make the whole city tremble in fear. And she knew even less that from the moment she nodded, her life would never be the same again. Celeste walked back into the kitchen with her heart beating wildly. She stood before Midnight Harbor's shelves of expensive ingredients: Maine lobster, slices of Alaskan salmon, spices imported from all over the world. But her hands didn't reach for any of them. Instead, she opened the refrigerator in the back, the one that held the ingredients the restaurant planned to throw away at the end of the night. Scraps of fish, a few small shrimp not good enough to meet serving standards, vegetables slightly wilted but still perfectly edible. Celeste knew exactly what she was going to make. A poor girl's seafood soup. She had created this dish back in her days at the Detroit orphanage, when the only ingredients she had were the leftovers the kitchen staff couldn't be bothered to use. There had been no recipe, no instructions, only instinct and the creativity of a 16-year-old girl trying to do something, anything, for her sick little brother. She remembered that night with painful clarity. Drew had been only 7 years old, lying in bed with his face pale from the pain in his heart. The boy hadn't been able to eat anything for 2 full days, and Celeste had slipped into the orphanage kitchen at midnight and made soup from whatever she could find. When Drew finished the bowl, he looked at her with eyes that lit up for the first time in days and said it was the best thing he had ever eaten. Celeste cried that night, not because she was sad, but because it was the first time she felt she could do something that truly mattered. Now, 11 years later, she was making that same soup again in the kitchen of a 5-star restaurant, for a man whose name she didn't even know. It was insane. This dish didn't belong on any fine dining menu. It was food for the poor, for orphan children, for hungry nights in a cold institution. But that man had asked her to cook the dish she chose, and this was the only dish Celeste truly wanted to make. 20 minutes later, she carried the bowl out to the dining room. Her hands trembled slightly as she set it down on the table in front of the mysterious man. The soup looked humble against the restaurant's costly white porcelain, like a poor child who had wandered by mistake into a party for the upper class. Celeste stood there, holding her breath as she waited. The man looked at the bowl for a moment, then lifted his spoon and tasted it. He said nothing. The silence stretched on. Celeste felt her face grow hot. She had been wrong. She had been reckless to think that a man like him would want to eat a cheap bowl of soup like this. She was about to apologize, to say that she would cook him something else. But the man looked up at her. His gray eyes were no longer as cold as before. There was something else in them now, something Celeste couldn't name. He said it was the best thing he had eaten in 10 years. Celeste was certain she had heard him wrong. She asked again, her voice shaking, and the man repeated the words, this time more slowly, more clearly, as though he wanted to make sure she understood every single one. Celeste didn't know how to respond. She thought he was joking, or mocking her, but those gray eyes were completely serious. There wasn't a trace of ridicule or pity in them. There was only naked honesty. The man asked what the dish was called. Celeste stammered that it didn't have a name. He was quiet for a moment, then said that in that case, she should give it one, because he would come back to eat it again. Then he stood and walked out of the restaurant without another word. Celeste stood there like someone who had lost her soul. When she turned back to clear the table, she saw the tip the man had left behind. She counted it again and again, unable to believe her eyes. The amount was equal to her entire month's salary. Celeste rushed outside, wanting to return it because she couldn't accept that much money for a cheap bowl of soup. But the streets of Chicago were cold and empty. The man had vanished into the night, as though he had never existed at all. Celeste stood there for a long moment, the money in her hand, the icy wind lifting her hair. She thought she would never see him again. She was wrong. The following Wednesday, at exactly 11 o'clock at night, the mysterious man walked through the doors of Midnight Harbor. He sat at the same table in the dark corner and asked to see Celeste. The week after that, he did the same. And the week after that as well. For 4 straight months, every Wednesday, he returned. They talked about everything. Books, music, the small, ordinary things in life. But he never spoke about his work, and Celeste never asked. She didn't know who she was cooking for. She only knew that every Wednesday, she found herself waiting to see that mysterious man walk through the door. And somehow, in some quiet, unspoken way, that had become the most important part of her week. 4 months passed like a dream Celeste didn't want to wake from. Every Wednesday night, the mysterious man appeared again in the dark corner of Midnight Harbor, and each time he did, they spoke a little longer than before. At first it was only a few brief exchanges about the food, but little by little those moments deepened into real conversations. They talked about books, about the old novels Celeste had found in the orphanage library, and the classics the man seemed to know by heart line for line. They talked about music, about jazz and blues, about the old songs drifting out from cheap bars on the South Side that Celeste heard every night on her way home from work. They talked about films, about the black and white movies the man loved, and the romantic films Celeste secretly watched on her old phone. But there was one thing they never spoke about, and that was his work. The man never mentioned his profession, his company, or anything at all connected to his life in the daylight. And Celeste never asked. She respected his privacy, just as he respected hers. One Wednesday night, when the restaurant was nearly closed, and only the two of them remained in the hush of that quiet space, the man asked Celeste about her dream. The question startled her. No one had asked her that in all 27 years of her life. Dreams were a luxury orphaned children were never meant to have. But that night, beneath the dim lights of Midnight Harbor, Celeste told him she wanted to open a small restaurant. Not the kind of elegant place this was, but somewhere warm and simple. She wanted to teach orphan children how to cook, so children like the girl she had once been would know they could create something beautiful out of things the world thought worthless. Celeste waited for the man's reaction. She waited for him to laugh at her, or tell her it was a foolish dream, that an orphan girl like her shouldn't dream so high. But the man only looked at her with those deep gray eyes and nodded slowly. He said it was a dream worth having. Only 4 words. But Celeste felt as though someone had just given her permission to hope. Everything fell apart on an ordinary afternoon when Celeste passed a newsstand on her way to the hospital to visit Drew. She saw a copy of Forbes displayed on the rack, and her heart seemed to stop. On the cover was the face of the Wednesday man, the man with whom she had shared her dreams and fears, the man she had begun to trust. The headline was printed in bold letters: Knox Ashford, Chicago's most powerful mafia boss, the Ashford Empire, and the secrets behind it. Celeste bought the magazine with the last coins in her pocket and devoured it on a park bench. The article described an empire of casinos and real estate, enormous business deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and political and economic influence spread across the Great Lakes region. And woven carefully between the lines were suggestions of activities no one dared mention directly, of an underworld Knox Ashford controlled with an iron hand. Celeste sat there for a long time, the magazine in her hands, the cold wind moving around her without her even feeling it. The gentle man who sat eating poor girl's soup every Wednesday, the one who listened to her talk about her dream of opening a small restaurant, the one who nodded and told her it was a dream worth having, that man was the underground king of Chicago. She felt deceived. Why hadn't he told her? Why had he let her believe he was only an ordinary businessman? Had she been nothing more than a rich man's game? A passing amusement for lonely nights? The questions churned through Celeste's mind like a storm. She decided she wouldn't see Knox again. That Wednesday, she called in sick even though she had never taken a day off in her life. The following Wednesday, she did the same. She thought he would forget her, would find some other distraction, would disappear from her life as though he had never entered it. But one evening, when Celeste returned to her run-down apartment on the South Side, she found Drew standing in the doorway with a strange expression on his face. Her brother told her someone was waiting for her inside. Celeste stepped in and stopped cold. Knox Ashford was standing in the middle of her cramped apartment, the most powerful man in Chicago, surrounded by peeling walls and worn-out furniture. He looked around, and Celeste knew what he was seeing. Hospital bills stacked on the table, Drew's GED books on the old sofa, the photograph of the two of them from their orphanage days hanging on the wall. Celeste asked, her voice colder than she intended, why he hadn't told her who he was. Knox was silent for a long time. Then he said, in a low, measured voice, that it was because for the first time in his life, someone had looked at him as though he were an ordinary man. Not a boss, not a monster, just a man who liked soup. He hadn't wanted to lose that. Celeste looked into Knox's gray eyes, and she saw something she had never expected to find there. Loneliness. A deep and terrible loneliness in a man feared by the entire world, yet truly seen by no one. But that understanding wasn't enough to erase the feeling of betrayal. Celeste opened the door and told Knox to leave. She said she didn't want anything to do with his world, that she had a life of her own, that Drew needed her, and she couldn't let anything threaten that. Knox looked at her for a long moment, then nodded and walked out without another word. Celeste closed the door and leaned back against the wall, her heart beating wildly. She thought that had been the last time she would ever see Knox Ashford. She was wrong. 2 weeks after the night, Celeste forced Knox out of her apartment. Her life went on as though nothing had happened. She went to work, came home, took care of Drew, and tried not to think about the man with those sorrowful gray eyes. But every night she lay awake, staring at the ceiling and wondering whether she had done the right thing. Then that fateful night arrived. Celeste finished her shift at nearly 2 o'clock in the morning, later than usual because the restaurant had hosted a large party. She walked back to her apartment through the biting Chicago cold, her mind exhausted and her steps heavy. When she opened the apartment door, darkness greeted her. Drew always left a light on for her, but tonight the apartment was completely black. Celeste turned on the light, and her heart seemed to stop. Drew was lying motionless on the floor, his face as pale as a sheet of white paper, his lips tinged blue-gray. She couldn't remember whether she screamed or not. She only remembered throwing herself down beside Drew, shaking him, calling his name, and feeling the terrible coldness of his skin beneath her hands. She called for an ambulance with fingers trembling so badly she could barely press the numbers. 15 minutes of waiting stretched like an entire century. Celeste sat on the cold floor, holding Drew in her arms, whispering prayers she hadn't known she still remembered. When the ambulance arrived, they took Drew away, and Celeste followed like a shadow. A hospital at midnight was another world entirely. Harsh white lights, the thick smell of disinfectant, the steady beeping of machines like the sound of fate counting down the last remaining moments. Celeste sat outside the emergency room for she didn't know how long, until a doctor finally stepped out with a grave expression on his face. He spoke the words Celeste had feared for years. Drew's heart had grown dangerously weak. He needed surgery urgently within the next few months, or the consequences would be devastating. The deposit for the operation was $47,000. Celeste stared at that number on the page, as though she were looking at a death sentence. $47,000. She earned less than $3,000 a month, and nearly all of it was already swallowed by rent, Drew's old hospital bills, and the bare minimum cost of surviving. It would take her more than a year to gather that much money, and Drew didn't have a year. At 2 o'clock in the morning, the hospital hallway was as silent as a graveyard. Celeste sat in a hard plastic chair gone cold beneath her, looking at Drew through the glass of his hospital room. Her brother lay there, 22 years old, surrounded by wires and machines, looking smaller and more fragile than ever. Drew was the only person Celeste had in this world. He was the reason she got up every morning, the reason she worked 14 hours a day, the reason she had never given up no matter how cruel life became. And now she could lose him, for the first time in many years. Celeste cried, not the silent kind of crying she had hidden in her pillow at night. She cried for real, as though every ache she had buried for 15 years had shattered open in that single moment. She cried for the parents she had lost, for the childhood stolen from her in the orphanage, for the hungry, freezing nights, for all the times she had been rejected, for Drew, for herself. She cried alone in that empty hospital corridor, and no one heard her. Then footsteps echoed through the silence. Celeste lifted her head, her eyes red and blurred with tears. Knox Ashford was standing in front of her. He wore a black coat, his face as cold and unreadable as always, but those gray eyes were fixed on her with something she couldn't name. Celeste didn't have time to ask how he knew, or how he had found her here. Knox didn't say a word. He simply turned and walked straight to the hospital billing desk. Celeste sat there, too exhausted to react, watching his back as he disappeared down the corridor. 15 minutes later, Knox returned. He sat down in the chair beside Celeste and placed a receipt in her hand. Celeste looked down, and her heart clenched so tightly it almost stopped. The entire deposit for Drew's surgery had been paid. $47,000. As though it were nothing more than the cost of a single dinner, Celeste asked, her voice hoarse from crying, why he had done this. Knox looked at her for a long moment, then said it was because she had given him something money couldn't buy. A meal with soul, a person who had looked at him and seen a human being, and now he wanted to give something back. Celeste shook her head and said she didn't need his pity. Knox didn't get angry. He only looked at her with those deep gray eyes and said this wasn't pity. This was him wanting to be here. They sat there in silence, two strangers from two different worlds, in the cold hospital hallway at nearly 3 o'clock in the morning. Celeste didn't say thank you. She didn't know what to say. She only sat there with the receipt in her hand, and for the first time in her life, she let another person carry a portion of her pain. That night, Celeste realized something. Knox Ashford might have been the most powerful mafia boss in Chicago, the man the entire city feared, the ruler of a vast underground empire. But he wasn't a monster. At least, not to her. 4 months after that night in the hospital, Celeste's life had changed in ways she never could have imagined. Drew was recovering well, and waiting for the date of his official surgery, his condition more stable now, because he was finally receiving proper medical care. And as for Celeste and Knox, they were officially dating, even though their relationship was still a secret from most people. Knox took Celeste to places she had never even dreamed of. Michelin-starred restaurants, private jazz performances, weekend trips to places she had only ever seen in magazines. He opened an entirely new world to her, one where money wasn't a problem, and every door opened the moment Knox Ashford arrived. But the thing Celeste loved most wasn't any of that luxury. What she loved most was still Wednesday nights at Midnight Harbor, when Knox sat in the familiar dark corner and she brought him his bowl of poor girl's seafood soup. Those simple moments, when they were only two people talking about ordinary things, were the moments Celeste treasured most. One night, Knox picked Celeste up after her shift and told her he had a surprise for her. They drove to one of the finest restaurants in Chicago, a place Celeste had heard of but never once believed she would ever set foot inside. But instead of leading her through the front doors, Knox took her up to the rooftop of the building. Celeste stepped out and stopped where she was. The rooftop had been decorated with hundreds of tiny candles, their flames flickering like stars that had fallen to earth. A small dining table stood in the center, covered in a cloth as white as snow, and beside the table was a portable kitchen, fully arranged with cooking tools and ingredients. Celeste turned to look at Knox, confused. Knox told her he didn't want her eating food cooked by someone else that night. He wanted her to cook for herself. It was the first time in Celeste's life that she had ever been allowed to cook for herself without worrying about cost, about time, or about anything at all. She stepped toward the kitchen, and her hands automatically reached for familiar ingredients. She made the seafood soup, the dish that had tied them together from the very first night. But this time, she cooked slowly, savoring every moment, not rushing the way she always had while working in a restaurant kitchen. Knox sat and watched her cook, his gray eyes never leaving her for even a second. When the soup was finished, they sat down at the table and looked out over Chicago below them. A million lights glittered like a golden carpet stretching all the way to the horizon, and Celeste felt as though they were standing at the very top of the world. Knox looked at her and said that before he met her, this city had only been territory he had to control, protect, and fight for. But now it was home. Celeste didn't know what to say. She only looked into the gray eyes of the man she had fallen in love with without ever realizing exactly when it had happened, and felt her heart grow warmer than it had ever been before. Then Knox took out a small box wrapped in black velvet. Celeste stopped breathing. She knew this was the moment she had read about in cheap romance novels, had watched in love stories on film, but she had never believed it would happen to her. Knox opened the box, and inside there wasn't a glittering diamond like Celeste had imagined. It was an emerald, deep green and breathtakingly beautiful in its simplicity. Knox said that anyone could buy a diamond, but this stone matched the color of her eyes. Celeste laughed through her tears. She laughed from happiness, from shock, from the sheer impossibility of Knox Ashford, the most powerful mafia boss in Chicago, kneeling in front of her with an emerald instead of an expensive diamond. Knox looked at her with utter seriousness and asked whether Celeste Morgan wanted to become the only person he would ever have dinner with every night. Celeste said yes, one simple word, but it changed everything. That night, on the highest rooftop in Chicago, surrounded by candlelight and the taste of poor girl's soup, Celeste thought this was the ending of the fairy tale. The orphan girl had found her prince, and they would live happily ever after. She was wrong. The fairy tale had never even begun, and the real darkness was already waiting ahead. The name of that darkness was Miriam Ashford. 2 weeks after the proposal, Knox told Celeste that it was time for her to meet his mother. Celeste had known this moment would come, but that didn't stop the anxiety from rising in her chest. She had heard a great deal about Miriam Ashford, the widowed woman who had single-handedly preserved the Ashford empire after her husband's death, the one even Knox spoke of with respect whenever he mentioned her. They drove out to the outskirts of Chicago, where grand mansions hid behind rows of ancient trees. The estate appeared like a medieval fortress in the heart of America, with towering iron gates engraved with a black eagle, the symbol of Ashford family power for 3 generations. Celeste took a deep breath and stepped through the gates, feeling as though she were walking into an entirely different world. Miriam Ashford was waiting for them at the front door. She was the embodiment of elegance, with platinum hair swept into a flawless chignon without a single strand out of place, a Bordeaux silk dress fitted to a figure still slender though she was nearly 60, and a necklace of priceless black pearls resting at her throat. But what caught Celeste's attention most was Miriam's smile. It was warm, almost too warm, as though Miriam had been waiting for Celeste her entire life. Miriam stepped forward and embraced her, the scent of expensive perfume drifting in the air. She welcomed her to the family and handed Celeste a small box. Inside was a string of pure white pearls. Miriam said it was a gift for her future daughter-in-law and fastened it around Celeste's neck with her own hands. Dinner took place in a grand dining room, at an oak table large enough for 20 people, though only 3 were seated there. Miriam asked Celeste about everything: her work at Midnight Harbor, her dream of opening her own restaurant, Drew, and the state of his health. She seemed thoughtful and attentive, nodding with sympathy when Celeste spoke of the hard years she had spent in the orphanage, smiling with encouragement when Celeste spoke about her plans for the future. Celeste began to relax. Maybe everything would be all right. Maybe the stories about difficult mothers-in-law were only prejudice. Maybe Miriam Ashford truly was welcoming her into the family. In the middle of dinner, Celeste excused herself to use the bathroom. The mansion was so vast that she lost her way in the maze of long hallways lined with portraits of Ashford ancestors gazing down as though passing judgment. As she was trying to find her way back to the dining room, she heard Miriam's voice drifting from a room whose door had been left slightly open. Celeste was about to walk away, but then she heard her own name. She froze, pressing herself against the wall, her heart pounding wildly. Miriam was speaking to someone, a man with a low voice Celeste didn't recognize. Miriam was ordering him to find out everything about Celeste, every secret, every weakness, everything in her past the girl might be hiding. Then she mentioned Drew, the young man in the hospital, and demanded that he be investigated too. Miriam's voice was cold as ice, nothing like the false warmth she had shown at the dinner table. She said who did the girl think she was, daring to walk into the Ashford family, that their bloodline couldn't be diluted by an orphan from a Detroit orphanage. Celeste stood there motionless, the blood in her veins seeming to turn to ice. She couldn't breathe. Everything, the smile, the embrace, the pearl necklace, the concerned questions, all of it had been an act. Miriam Ashford wasn't welcoming her. She was investigating her, looking for a way to remove her. The man in the room said something Celeste couldn't quite hear. Then footsteps sounded. Celeste quickly turned away, forcing herself to walk calmly back toward the dining room before anyone could see her. When she sat down again, her hands were trembling so badly she had to hide them beneath her napkin. Miriam returned a few minutes later, her smile still perfect as though nothing had happened. She looked at Celeste and asked if she was all right, saying her face had gone pale. Celeste forced a smile and said she was fine, only a little tired from the weather. Miriam nodded with understanding and said the Ashford family needed strong women, and that she believed Celeste would be one of them. Celeste looked into Miriam's eyes, trying to find some trace of the cruelty she had just heard. But the woman hid it too well. The smile was still warm, the gaze still gentle, and if Celeste hadn't overheard that conversation, she never would have suspected a thing. On the drive home, Knox asked Celeste what she thought of his mother. Celeste was quiet for a long time, staring out the car window, where the streetlights slid past like blurred streaks of light. Then she said that Miriam was very thoughtful. Knox smiled and said he knew his mother would like her. Celeste didn't tell Knox what she had heard. She didn't speak of the investigation, or the contempt in Miriam's voice, or the way she had called her an orphan from Detroit. She thought perhaps she had heard wrong. Perhaps it was a misunderstanding. Perhaps everything would be fine if she could prove herself to Miriam. That was her first mistake, and it wouldn't be her last. 2 months after the meeting at the estate, Celeste stood before the large mirror in the bridal room, looking at the unfamiliar woman staring back at her. The pure white wedding gown embraced her figure completely, its long train spilling across the floor like a silver stream, the tiny crystals sewn into the bodice glimmering beneath the lights. The orphan girl from a Detroit orphanage looked like a princess from a fairy tale. Celeste wondered whether this was truly happening, whether this was some dream she would wake from and find herself still lying on the old bed in that shabby apartment on the south side. But the soft music drifting in from outside, the murmur of 500 guests in the grand hall, the faint fragrance of white roses in the air, all of it was real. This was her wedding day. The door opened, and Celeste turned, thinking it was one of her bridesmaids coming to get her. But it wasn't. Miriam Ashford stepped inside, and Celeste's heart tightened at once. Miriam was wearing a shimmering silver gown, the fabric catching the light like snow under the moon. The color was almost white, almost the same shade as a bride's dress. Celeste knew this wasn't a coincidence. Miriam was doing it on purpose. She was sending a message, but Celeste said nothing. Miriam walked forward, her heels tapping softly against the wooden floor. She stopped behind Celeste, and the two of them looked into the mirror together. Their reflection seemed like some strange painting, the young bride in white, and the mother-in-law wrapped in cold silver. Miriam placed a hand on Celeste's shoulder, her fingers tipped with Bordeaux red polish like drops of blood against Celeste's pale skin. Miriam said Celeste looked beautiful, her voice sweet as honey, though her eyes in the mirror were cold as ice. Then she added, "But beauty fades, my girl." Celeste didn't answer. She didn't know what to say. Then Miriam leaned closer, lowering herself until her mouth was near Celeste's ear. Her breath carried the scent of expensive perfume, but to Celeste it felt as though a serpent were whispering beside her face. Miriam spoke in a voice so low that only the two of them could hear. She said Celeste should ask Knox about Vanessa, should ask where she had gone. Celeste froze, the blood in her body turning to stone. She turned around, but Miriam had already stepped back, that perfect smile resting on her lips as though she had just offered a blessing instead of a threat disguised as one. Miriam said she wished her happiness, then turned and walked out, leaving Celeste alone with 1,000 questions twisting through her mind. Who was Vanessa? Where had she gone? Why did Miriam want Celeste to ask about her? Why had she said it with such a threatening tone? Celeste wanted to run after Miriam, wanted to demand an explanation. But at that exact moment, the wedding music began, the familiar notes of canon in D echoing through the air. The door opened, and a bridesmaid stepped in to say it was time. Celeste drew in a deep breath and forced herself to push Vanessa from her mind. She stepped into the great hall, where 500 pairs of eyes turned toward her. Strange faces, polite smiles, expensive suits, dazzling evening gowns. This was Chicago high society, the world Celeste had never imagined she would stand among. But she didn't look at them. She looked at only one person, the man waiting at the end of the aisle in a black suit, his gray eyes fixed on her as though she were his entire world, Knox Ashford, the man who had walked into Midnight Harbor 14 months earlier and changed her life forever. Celeste walked down the aisle, each step carrying her toward a new future. When she reached Knox, he took her hand, and that single touch made all her anxiety fade away. Celeste decided to push Vanessa from her mind. Today was the happiest day of her life. Today she was becoming the wife of the man she loved. Secrets could wait. They spoke their vows, exchanged rings, and when Knox kissed her, the crowd erupted in thunderous applause. Celeste Morgan, the orphan girl from a Detroit orphanage, had officially become Celeste Ashford. She thought this was the beginning of happiness. She thought every hardship was behind her now, and that the future would hold nothing but light. She was wrong. The name Vanessa would return to haunt her. And by the time she learned the truth about that woman, everything would already be too late. 1 month after the wedding, Celeste moved into Knox's penthouse in the Obsidian Tower. The apartment sat on the 60th floor, with floor-to-ceiling glass walls looking out over Lake Michigan, and interiors so lavish and expensive they were beyond anything Celeste could have imagined. But no matter how stunning it was, this place didn't feel like home. It felt like a museum she had only been given temporary permission to live in. Knox was often away because of work. He said there were conflicts with competitors that needed to be handled. Complicated matters he didn't want Celeste worrying about. She understood, or at least she tried to. This was the life of a powerful boss's wife. She couldn't expect Knox to always be by her side. But the loneliness inside that enormous penthouse began to weigh heavily on Celeste. And then, strange things began to happen. Miriam called every day, as steady and precise as clockwork. She asked after Celeste in a voice full of concern. But the questions she asked made Celeste shiver. Miriam said, "You drank green tea at 3 o'clock yesterday afternoon, didn't you? That's good for your health." Celeste went still. She really had drunk green tea at 3 o'clock the day before, but she hadn't told anyone, and Knox hadn't been home. How did Miriam know? Then, on another occasion, Miriam asked, "You talked to Drew for 47 minutes last night, didn't you? Is he doing well?" A chill ran down Celeste's spine. Miriam knew exactly how long she had spoken to Drew on the phone. Exactly to the minute. Celeste began to pay attention. Every time Miriam called, she mentioned tiny details from Celeste's daily life, things no one could possibly know unless they were watching her. Celeste thought she was becoming paranoid. Maybe she had mentioned those things without realizing it, and simply forgotten. Maybe the housekeeping staff had told Miriam. Maybe it was all just coincidence. But suspicion had already planted itself in her mind, and it refused to disappear. One afternoon, while Knox was away, Celeste began searching the penthouse. She didn't know exactly what she was looking for, but she needed to do something to confirm or silence the fear growing inside her. She checked every corner, every stretch of wall, every decorative object, and then she found it. Beneath the crystal chandelier in the living room, hidden among the glittering glass drops, was a tiny device no larger than the tip of her finger. A camera. Celeste's hands trembled as she kept searching. In the bedroom, hidden inside a decorative picture frame, was another camera. In the kitchen, concealed behind the wall clock, there was yet another one. Celeste stood in the middle of the penthouse, her heart racing, feeling as though 1,000 eyes were fixed on her from every direction. She called the building technician, trying to keep her voice calm. The man in uniform examined the devices and said they were part of the building's security system, not separate equipment installed privately. Celeste asked who controlled that security system. The technician hesitated for a moment, as though weighing whether he should answer at all, then finally said that Miriam Ashford controlled it, because she managed the entire operation of the Obsidian Tower. Celeste stood frozen. Everything was suddenly clear. Miriam wasn't only her mother-in-law. She owned the building, controlled the security system, and was watching Celeste's every move. This luxurious penthouse wasn't her home. It was a giant glass cage, and Miriam Ashford held the key. Celeste wanted to tell Knox immediately. She wanted him to know that his mother was watching them, invading their privacy, violating the space that was supposed to belong to them. But when Knox returned that evening, his face looked exhausted and strained. He said there was a serious problem with a rival, that he needed to focus on dealing with it, that he might have to leave town for a few days. Celeste looked at her husband, looked at the worry lines etched into his forehead, and couldn't bear to add another burden to his shoulders. Knox was facing problems she couldn't fully understand, conflicts in the underground world she didn't want to know too much about. She couldn't place the issue with his mother on him too at a time like this. She chose to stay silent and watch. Maybe this was only a normal security measure. Maybe Miriam did this with everyone in the building. Maybe she was overreacting. Celeste told herself those things each night as she lay down in bed, but she still couldn't sleep peacefully. She knew someone was watching. She knew she didn't have a single moment of privacy inside her own home. Celeste didn't know that this was only the first step in Miriam's plan. Miriam didn't only want to watch her, she wanted to destroy her piece by piece. And the next steps would be far more cruel. 2 months after the wedding, Miriam announced something that on the surface sounded like good news. Drew would be transferred to Ashford Medical Center, the finest private hospital in Chicago, and the full cost of his treatment would be covered by the Ashford Charity Foundation. At first, Celeste was deeply grateful. This was the kind of hospital only the wealthiest people in the city could access, with top physicians and the most advanced equipment available. Drew would be cared for better than anywhere else. She didn't question it. But then strange things began to appear. Whenever Celeste wanted to visit Drew, she was told that all visits had to be registered 24 hours in advance, according to hospital policy. She complied, but every time she came, there was always a hospital staff member accompanying her, sitting in the corner of the room and watching them talk. Drew's phone calls were also restricted under the explanation that they needed to be monitored because of medical procedures. One night, Drew secretly sent Celeste a text message, using the phone of a kind nurse. He wrote, "It's beautiful here, sis, but why do I feel like I'm in prison?" When she read that message, Celeste felt her heart tighten. She knew something was wrong, but she had no proof, and Drew was receiving the best medical care possible. She couldn't complain without seeming ungrateful, and Drew wasn't the only thing being taken from her. Jenny, the only former coworker from Midnight Harbor with whom Celeste had stayed in touch, came to visit her a week after Drew was moved to the new hospital. They drank coffee and talked the way they used to, and for the first time in weeks, Celeste felt like herself again. But a week later, Jenny called, her voice frantic. She had been fired without explanation, and the night before, someone had vandalized her car right outside her home. Jenny was terrified and didn't understand what was happening. The next day, Celeste received an envelope from Miriam. Inside was a newspaper clipping about a minor car accident in the neighborhood where Jenny lived, along with a handwritten note in Miriam's elegant script that said, "Chicago isn't safe for people who don't know how to keep their distance." Celeste understood the message. Anyone who came too close to her would suffer. Then came the kitchen. One day, Celeste returned home and discovered that the entire kitchen in the penthouse had been upgraded. The cooking equipment she knew was gone, replaced by a showroom of smart induction ranges she didn't know how to use, unfamiliar appliances with hundreds of buttons, and a system that, according to the technician, should only be used by professionally trained chefs. Miriam called immediately afterward, her voice sweet as she explained that the house already had a private chef now, so Celeste didn't need to exhaust herself cooking anymore. Cooking was the only thing that made Celeste feel like herself, the last connection she still had to the person she used to be, and now that too had been taken away. But the worst thing was what began to happen with Knox. He started to change. Not obviously, not all at once, but Celeste noticed it. Knox looked at her differently. Strange silences crept into their conversations, searching glances when he thought she wasn't paying attention. Celeste didn't know why, until she accidentally overheard a conversation between Knox and Miriam. Miriam said she didn't want to say anything, but she was worried about him, that someone had sent her photographs, and she didn't know what to think. Celeste investigated and discovered that Knox had received anonymous reports, accompanied by photos of her talking to a strange man. That man was actually Drew's doctor, and the conversation had been completely harmless. But the angle of the photographs made it look like a secret meeting. There were even messages claiming that Celeste frequently called an unknown phone number late at night, a number that was in fact Drew's line at the hospital. Miriam was orchestrating everything. She was isolating Celeste from her brother, from her friends, from her passion for cooking, and now from her own husband. She was slowly erasing everything that made Celeste who she was, turning her into an empty shadow inside that luxurious penthouse. And the most terrifying part was that Knox was beginning to believe it. One night, when Celeste tried to explain the photograph with Drew's doctor, Knox looked at her with an expression she had never seen before. It was suspicion. For the first time in their relationship, Knox didn't completely trust her. Miriam was driving a wedge between them, and Celeste didn't know how to stop it. She was slowly becoming a shadow inside her own marriage, while the mother-in-law with the perfect smile was pushing her step by step toward the edge of the abyss. 3 months after the wedding, Celeste stood in the bathroom, staring at the pregnancy test in her hand, with her heart pounding wildly. 2 clear red lines had appeared, confirming what she had suspected for the past 2 weeks. She was pregnant. Celeste's first feeling was pure joy. A child, her child and Knox's. A real family, the very thing the orphan girl from the Detroit orphanage had never dared to dream of. She was going to be a mother, and she would give her child all the love she herself had never received. But right on the heels of that joy, fear came crashing over her like a wave of ice. Miriam. If Miriam had already seen Celeste as a weed that needed to be pulled out, then what would she see this child as? A piece of Ashford blood, diluted by an orphan. Celeste couldn't bear to think any further. She decided to keep it from Knox for 2 weeks, trying to find a way to tell her husband without letting Miriam know first. She would take Knox somewhere far from the camera-filled penthouse, somewhere with only the two of them, and she would tell him there. But in this giant glass house, that was impossible. Celeste had tried to hide it. She bought the pregnancy test at a pharmacy far from downtown, paid in cash so there wouldn't be a trace. She took the test in the bathroom where she believed there were no cameras. She hid the pregnancy test in her handbag and threw it away in a public trash bin on the way to visit Drew. But she had forgotten one thing. The cameras in the penthouse weren't only in the obvious places. They were everywhere. And Miriam Ashford was watching her every move. 1 week later, Knox came home with a radiant smile and pulled Celeste into his arms. He asked why she hadn't told him sooner, said this was the most wonderful news, said he was going to be a father. Celeste went still in her husband's embrace, the blood in her body turning cold. How did Knox know? She hadn't told a soul. Then she understood. Someone had told Knox. Someone had seen her buy the pregnancy test, or take it in the bathroom. Someone had access to every camera in this building. Knox was so happy that he didn't notice the tension in Celeste's body as he held her. But then he pulled back, looked into her eyes, and the smile slowly faded from his lips. He asked what she was afraid of, because he could see the fear in her eyes. Celeste wanted to tell the truth. She wanted to tell Knox about the cameras, about Miriam's threats, about the feeling of being watched and isolated for months. But she couldn't. Knox was happy, and for the first time in weeks he was looking at her without suspicion in his eyes. She couldn't destroy that moment. Celeste said she was afraid she wouldn't be good enough to be a mother. That was half the truth, but not all of it. Knox held her and said she would be the most wonderful mother. He didn't know that Celeste's real fear wasn't motherhood. It was the woman standing one floor above them, watching through a screen. That very afternoon, Miriam summoned Celeste to the estate. She said she wanted to congratulate her daughter-in-law in private. When the door to Miriam's study closed, the warm smile on her face vanished as though it had never existed. Miriam's eyes were cold as ice as she looked at Celeste. She said only 3 words, her voice calm and even as though she were commenting on the weather. "I know your little secret, and I will ensure this bloodline is protected, with or without you." Celeste stood there, unable to speak, unable to understand what handle it meant. Then the door opened, and Miriam turned back into the perfect smiling hostess, stepping out to greet Knox, who was waiting in the hall, saying that she and her daughter-in-law had just had a very good talk. 1 week later, Celeste received a gift from Miriam. It was a book about healthy pregnancy, a beautiful hardcover with an image of a happy mother holding her pregnant belly. Celeste opened the book, and her heart nearly stopped. The pages about miscarriage had been marked with yellow highlighter. The pages about pregnancy complications had their corners folded neatly. The pages about all the things that could go wrong with a fetus had been underlined again and again. Celeste stared at those marked pages, her hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped the book. This wasn't a gift. It was a threat. Miriam Ashford was telling her that she knew about the child, and that she had a plan. The real war had only just begun. A few weeks after the announcement, when the pregnancy entered its 5th month, Miriam Ashford began to show a completely different face. She became attentive, caring, and concerned for her daughter-in-law to such a degree that even Knox seemed surprised. Miriam called every day to ask about Celeste's health, sent fresh flowers to the penthouse every week, and constantly reminded her son to take very good care of his wife. Knox looked at this change with visible relief, and told Celeste that his mother simply needed time to adjust, that the news of her grandchild had softened her heart. Celeste nodded and smiled, but deep inside, she knew the truth. The book with the highlighted pages about miscarriage still haunted her every night. Miriam began sending prenatal vitamins to the penthouse every single day. The pills were carefully packaged in elegant boxes, accompanied by handwritten notes from Miriam saying these were the best kind, that she had ordered them from overseas for her. Celeste looked at the pale pink vitamins and felt a vague, creeping fear. But she had no reason to refuse them. After all, they were only vitamins. Then Miriam hired a private nurse named Bridget to care for Celeste around the clock. Bridget was a middle-aged woman with neatly arranged brown hair and a professional smile. She followed Celeste like a shadow, making sure she took her vitamins on time, ate at the proper hours, and did nothing that could affect the baby. Celeste felt suffocated, but Knox said this was a good thing, that his mother was trying to make amends. Miriam even took Celeste to see the doctor she trusted most, a man named Dr. Harmon. He was a famous psychiatrist, and Miriam explained that pregnancy could cause emotional strain, that it was best to have a specialist monitoring her. Celeste didn't want to go, but she had no choice. And then the strange symptoms began. Celeste started growing weaker. She was dizzy often, more nauseated than was normal for pregnancy, and so exhausted that there were days she couldn't get out of bed. Every night she had nightmares. Dark dreams she couldn't clearly remember when she woke, leaving behind only a paralyzing sense of fear. There were nights when she jolted awake and saw the shape of a person standing beside the bed, but when she blinked, the figure disappeared. Paranoia began to invade Celeste's mind. She felt as though someone was putting something into her drinking water. She caught Bridget looking at her with strange eyes. She grew suspicious of every vitamin she swallowed, but she had no proof. And every time she tried to voice those suspicions, people looked at her as though she were losing her mind. Celeste began to wonder whether she truly was going insane. Dr. Harmon met with Celeste after a few weeks and gave the diagnosis that she was suffering from severe anxiety disorder and needed sedatives to stabilize her mind. Miriam sat beside her, nodding in agreement, and told the doctor that she had suspected this for a long time, that her daughter-in-law had a complicated psychological history because she had grown up in an orphanage. Celeste wanted to scream that it was a lie, that she had been completely normal before stepping into the Ashford family. But who would believe her? An orphan girl with no family, no friends, no one standing on her side, against Miriam Ashford and a famous doctor? Then Sloane appeared. Knox's sister swept into the penthouse one afternoon, loud and dazzling as always. Sloane was 28 years old, with shining blonde hair and the expensive fashion sense of a rich man's daughter. She talked without stopping about shopping, about the parties she attended, about the men who chased after her. Celeste sat listening, exhausted and uninterested, while Bridget stood in the corner of the room watching. But then Bridget said she needed to go get medicine for Celeste, and stepped outside. The instant the door closed, Sloane changed completely. Her eyes turned serious, sharp, utterly different from the shallow, glittering persona she had just been performing. Sloane quickly slipped a small folded note into Celeste's hand, her gaze locking onto Celeste's with urgency. Then, the moment Bridget's footsteps sounded in the hallway, Sloane turned back into her carefree self, smiled brightly, and said out loud that they should go shopping together next week, then walked out as though nothing had happened. Celeste waited until she was alone in the bathroom, the one place she hoped had no cameras, before daring to open the note. The rushed handwriting stared back at her. "Don't take the vitamins. Don't trust Bridget. Meet me at the cafe on the first floor at 3 o'clock. Alone." Celeste read the words again and again, her heart pounding wildly. Then she hid the note inside her bra, the only place she knew for certain no camera could see. She didn't know what Sloane was about to reveal. She didn't know whether this was another trap. But she knew one thing. This might be her only chance to understand what was truly happening to her, and to the child growing inside her. The next day, Celeste told Bridget that she wanted to go down to the cafe on the first floor for a cup of herbal tea. Bridget offered to go with her, but Celeste said she only needed a little space for herself, that Dr. Harmon had advised her to spend some time alone to reduce stress. Bridget hesitated, but in the end she nodded, perhaps because she didn't want to go against the doctor's advice. Celeste stepped into the cafe with her heart pounding so hard she thought everyone around her could hear it. Sloane was already seated at a corner table, dressed as elegantly as ever, with a designer handbag resting on the table and a cup of coffee in front of her. She looked like any wealthy young woman waiting for a friend to go shopping. Celeste sat across from her, and the two of them began talking as though they were discussing handbags and high heels. But beneath the table, Sloane slid an envelope toward Celeste. Celeste opened it, and inside was a sheet of paper filled with medical terms she had to read over several times before she fully understood it. Sloane leaned forward, her voice so low that only the two of them could hear, and said that the vitamins her mother had been sending Celeste contained heavy sedatives and substances designed to cloud Celeste's mind and weaken her body. Miriam didn't want a healthy daughter-in-law. She wanted a shadow, someone she could declare mentally unfit to keep her own child once it was born. Celeste felt nausea rise in her throat, and this time it wasn't morning sickness. She placed a hand over her stomach, where her child was growing, and felt a mixture of fear and rage unlike anything she had ever known. Miriam was trying to kill her baby, slowly, silently, beneath the disguise of care. Celeste looked up at Sloane and asked in a trembling voice who Vanessa was. The name Miriam had whispered in her ear on her wedding day, the name that had haunted her for months. Sloane was silent for a long time. Her eyes dropped to her coffee cup, and Celeste saw them slowly begin to redden. When Sloane finally spoke, Her voice was no longer sharp as before, but fragile and full of pain. Sloane said that Vanessa had been Knox's fiancée 5 years earlier. She had been a young designer, beautiful and talented, and Knox had loved her madly. They had been engaged and were preparing for their wedding. Then Vanessa discovered she was pregnant, 3 months along. Sloane said she had been so happy, and Knox had been too, but Miriam hadn't. She said Vanessa wasn't worthy of Ashford blood, that she was only an ambitious girl trying to climb higher by getting pregnant. Then one night, Vanessa disappeared. Miriam told Knox that Vanessa had run away with another man, that she had never truly loved Knox at all, and Knox had believed her. He had believed his mother. Celeste asked why Sloane had never told Knox the truth. Sloane looked up, and tears had already begun to slide down her cheeks. She said she had tried. 5 years earlier, just after Vanessa vanished, Sloane had tried to tell Knox that something wasn't right, that Vanessa wasn't the kind of woman who would simply run away like that. But Miriam found out. She called Sloane into her study and threatened to cast her out of the family, to cut her off from everything completely, the money, the status, even the right to see Knox. Sloane had only been 23 then, and she had never lived a single day without the protection of the Ashford family. She had been terrified. She had stayed silent, and Vanessa was never found again. Sloane said she had been a coward, her voice choked with grief and self-hatred. She said there hadn't been a single night in 5 years when she hadn't thought about Vanessa, about the unborn baby, about the niece or nephew she would never get to meet. For 5 years, Sloane had played the role of the useless rich girl who cared only about shopping and parties so Miriam wouldn't suspect her. For 5 years, she had quietly gathered evidence, waiting for the chance to expose the truth. Sloane took Celeste's hand, her eyes determined even though tears still clung to them. She said they couldn't let it happen again. But she needed Celeste's help. They needed Miriam to confess. Without a confession, Knox wouldn't believe it. He loved his mother, and no matter what Miriam had done, Knox would still find a way to excuse her if there wasn't undeniable proof. Sloane said the plan was for her to keep pretending to be the spoiled socialite, for Celeste to pretend to take the vitamins while secretly throwing them away, and for the two of them to gather evidence piece by piece until they had enough to bring Miriam down. Celeste looked at Sloane, the woman she had once thought cared only about shopping and parties, and asked why she trusted her. Sloane gave her a sad smile and said it was because Celeste looked into Knox's eyes in exactly the same way Vanessa once had, and she didn't want to watch that look disappear again. In the days after her meeting with Sloane, Celeste began performing the most important role of her life. Every morning, when Bridget brought the vitamins along with breakfast, Celeste accepted the pale pink pill with obedient calm. She placed it in her mouth, took a sip of water, and smiled at Bridget, but the pill remained hidden beneath her tongue, and the moment Bridget turned away, Celeste went into the bathroom, spat it out, and flushed it down the toilet. Day after day, she repeated this with absolute care. Celeste's health began to improve. The dizziness slowly faded, the nausea grew less severe, and she no longer had nightmares every night. But she kept pretending to be weak, kept complaining of headaches and exhaustion, kept allowing Bridget to guide her through the penthouse as though she could barely manage on her own. No one suspected a thing. Miriam called every day and acted worried about her daughter-in-law's condition, and Celeste answered in a frail voice that she was trying but still wasn't getting better. Meanwhile, Sloane began visiting the penthouse more often. On the surface, these were simply visits from a concerned sister-in-law, bringing expensive gifts and idle stories about Chicago high society. But in truth, Sloane was watching Bridget. She paid attention to every movement the nurse made, every phone call, every text message. 1 week later, Sloane sent Celeste a secretly recorded video. In it, Bridget was standing in the penthouse hallway, a phone pressed to her ear, speaking to someone. Her voice came through clearly from the microphone of a phone Sloane had hidden inside a flower vase nearby. Bridget was reporting to Miriam about Celeste's condition, saying that she was still weak and tired, and asking whether the dosage needed to be increased. Miriam's voice came through from the other end of the line, cold and calculated, instructing Bridget to keep the dosage the same, that there was no need to rush, that everything should be allowed to unfold naturally. Celeste watched the video with her fists clenched tight. This was clear proof that Bridget was acting under Miriam's orders. But Sloane said it still wasn't enough. They needed more. Sloane brought the evidence to someone she trusted completely, Gideon. He was Knox's elderly advisor, 65 years old, with white silver hair and eyes sharp as blades. Gideon had once been the right hand of Knox's father, the man who had helped build the Ashford Empire from its earliest days. When Knox's father died, Gideon stayed on to serve his son, but his relationship with Miriam had never been good. Gideon was the only person in the Ashford Empire who dared speak the truth to Knox, who dared challenge decisions he believed were wrong. And for a long time, he had already suspected Miriam. He saw the way she controlled everything, the way she removed anyone who stood in her path, the way she kept Knox in her grasp like a puppet, but he had never had proof, and Knox loved his mother too much to hear any warning against her. When Sloane handed Gideon the lab results on the vitamins and the video of Bridget, the old man's eyes lit with grim confirmation. He said that at last there was proof, that this time she had become too reckless. Gideon began digging deeper. He investigated Dr. Harmon, the psychiatrist Miriam trusted, and what he discovered shocked them all. Dr. Harmon had once had his medical license revoked in another state for serious ethical violations. He had prescribed medication improperly to a patient, leading to severe consequences. His career should have ended there. But Miriam had appeared and saved him. She had arranged everything, helped him secure a new license in Illinois, and in return, he obeyed every demand she made. Gideon met with Sloane in a secure room, one with no cameras and no ears belonging to Miriam. He said they now had enough evidence to prove that Miriam had deliberately tried to harm the unborn child. This evidence could send her to prison. But if they wanted to bring Miriam down completely, if they wanted Knox to see his mother's true face and never again be able to excuse her, they needed something else. They needed her confession. Gideon looked at Sloane and said that Celeste would have to face Miriam alone, that it was the only way. Miriam was too careful. She would never admit anything in front of anyone else. But if Celeste could provoke her, if she could make her lose control, Miriam might speak the truth aloud. Sloane was silent for a long moment, staring at the laptop screen showing images from the penthouse security cameras. Celeste was sitting alone in the living room, one hand resting on the curve of her belly, now visibly round, her face weary, but her eyes still unbroken. The orphan girl from the Detroit orphanage was going to face Miriam Ashford, the woman who had made so many people disappear without leaving a trace. But this time, she wouldn't be alone. The pregnancy had entered its 6th month, and Celeste was wearing herself thin, waiting for the right moment to confront Miriam. But before she could make her move, Miriam struck first. That night, Miriam told Knox that she wanted to stay at the penthouse so she could better care for her daughter-in-law. Knox agreed without the slightest suspicion. Celeste lay in bed trying to sleep, but she couldn't. She knew Miriam was somewhere in this apartment, watching her, waiting. At 3 o'clock in the morning, Celeste suddenly woke with a strange sensation. It wasn't a sound, and it wasn't a dream. It was the feeling that someone was touching her. She opened her eyes slowly, her heart pounding wildly. Pale moonlight slipped through the enormous glass wall, casting faint silver streaks across the room, and in that light, Celeste saw a figure bent over at the foot of the bed. Bridget. The nurse was doing something near Celeste's feet, and in her hand she held something Celeste couldn't make out in the darkness. She wasn't checking a pulse. She wasn't massaging her. Something cold touched Celeste's ankle. Celeste screamed. She jerked her leg away and scrambled back toward the headboard, her cry echoing through the silent penthouse. Bridget straightened up, her face disturbingly calm in the moonlight. Hurried footsteps came from the study. Knox ran in and turned on the lights, flooding the room with brightness. He looked at Celeste curled into the corner of the bed, then at Bridget standing beside it with her professional expression, and asked what was happening. Bridget answered before Celeste could even speak. Her voice was steady and calm in a way that felt terrifying. She said Celeste was having another nightmare, that she had only been checking the pulse in her ankle because she was worried about her circulation. Celeste shouted that Bridget had been holding something, that she had seen it. Bridget slowly lifted both hands and spread them open. There was nothing there. 2 empty hands. Bridget looked at Knox and said in a voice dripping with false pity that he could see for himself. She was panicking. The bedroom door opened again, and Miriam stepped inside. She was wearing a Bordeaux silk robe, her platinum hair still perfectly arranged even though it was 3 o'clock in the morning. Her face was full of concern, but Celeste could see the cold glint in those eyes. Miriam walked to the bed and said gently that her daughter-in-law needed rest, that the doctor had already said the sedatives could cause hallucinations, that this was normal. Then she turned to Knox, her gaze full of meaning. and said that she had been worried about Celeste's mental state for a long time, that she thought closer supervision was necessary. Knox stood in the middle of the room, his gray eyes moving back and forth between the three women. He looked at Celeste, his wife trembling on the bed with panic in her eyes. He looked at Miriam, his mother with a face full of sincere concern. He looked at Bridget, the professional nurse with her calm and rational demeanor. Celeste looked into her husband's eyes and begged him silently. She wanted him to believe her. She wanted him to see the truth. She wanted him to stand on her side, even just once. Knox opened his mouth and said that maybe Bridget should take a few days off. Celeste's heart flared with sudden hope, but immediately, Miriam cut in, her voice cold as ice. She asked whether her son was doubting his own mother, whether he was going to believe the words of a girl with psychological problems over the woman who had given birth to him and raised him for 33 years. Knox fell silent. He said nothing. He didn't defend Celeste. He didn't send Bridget away. He only stood there, torn between wife and mother, and his silence was a clearer answer than any words could have been. Miriam gave a faint smile, led Knox out of the room, and said they should let his wife rest, that they would talk tomorrow. The door closed, and Celeste was left alone in the brightly lit room. She watched Knox's back disappear beyond the door, and it felt as though something inside her had just shattered. That night, Celeste stayed awake until morning, one hand resting on the full curve of her belly. She realized a painful truth. Knox wasn't standing with her. He loved her, she believed that, but he was still controlled by his mother. He still couldn't see Miriam's true face. If Celeste wanted to survive, if she wanted to protect the child growing inside her, she would have to save herself. And to do that, she would have to face Miriam Ashford directly, alone. 1 week after that horrifying night with Bridget, Padres knew she couldn't wait any longer. She had already contacted Sloane and Gideon, had already prepared the evidence about the poisoned vitamins and the video of Bridget reporting to Miriam. She was ready to face her mother-in-law and force her to admit everything, but Miriam was always one step ahead. That morning, Celeste called Drew as usual. She called the number at Ashford Medical Center, the hospital where her brother was being treated, but instead of the familiar ringing sound, all she heard was the dead signal of a phone that had been turned off. Celeste called again. Still off. She called 5 more times, her heart beating faster with every lifeless tone. Finally, she called the hospital directly and asked to speak with Drew Morgan in the cardiology unit. The receptionist was silent for a moment, then said in the flat, trained voice of someone repeating policy that Drew Morgan had been transferred to another specialty facility. Celeste asked which facility, her voice beginning to shake. The receptionist replied that they weren't permitted to disclose that information at the sponsor's request. Celeste understood immediately. The sponsor, the Ashford Charity Foundation, Miriam. She hung up and called Miriam at once. Miriam answered on the second ring, her voice calm and almost cheerful, as though they were discussing the weather. Miriam said Drew was fine, that he was in a very good place, that she only wanted to make sure he was being cared for properly. Celeste clenched her teeth and asked what she had done to her brother. Miriam gave a soft laugh through the phone, a laugh as cold as ice water. She said she hadn't done anything at all. She had only arranged things. Then her voice dropped lower, slower, each word falling like a heavy stone. She said that Celeste knew, with heart surgeries this complicated, sometimes they were delayed for many reasons. Sometimes there wasn't a specialist available. Sometimes the equipment wasn't ready. Or they could even be cancelled entirely if the sponsor withdrew. Silence stretched between them. Celeste felt the blood in her body turn cold. Miriam continued in a sweetness so frightening it made Celeste's skin crawl, saying that everything depended on the family's cooperation, and that she was sure Celeste understood what she meant. Then the line went dead. Celeste didn't know when the phone slipped from her hand. She only knew that her knees hit the floor, and she was kneeling in the middle of that luxurious penthouse, her body trembling uncontrollably. Drew, her brother, the only person she had carried with her from those dark days in the Detroit orphanage. He was somewhere out there, not knowing what was happening, not knowing that the life-saving surgery he needed was being used as a hostage. Celeste wanted to scream. She wanted to smash everything in that room, all those expensive, luxurious things she had never wanted, the glass walls that held her like a cage. She wanted to run to the estate and confront Miriam immediately, to seize her by the collar and force her to say where Drew was. But then she felt a small movement in her belly. Her child, 6 months old, growing inside her, trusting her to protect it. Celeste placed a hand over her swollen stomach and drew in a deep breath. She couldn't act recklessly. She couldn't let emotion control her. Miriam wanted her afraid, wanted her panicked, wanted her to sign divorce papers and disappear from Knox's life. But Celeste Morgan wasn't the kind of person who gave up easily. She had survived the orphanage. She had raised Drew alone for years. She had fought for every meal, every dollar, every chance life had ever given her. She wouldn't let Miriam Ashford defeat her. Celeste wiped away her tears and stood up. She looked around the penthouse once more, but this time with different eyes. This was no longer her prison. It would be her battlefield. And she would fight. She picked up her phone and sent a message to Sloane. "I'm ready. Arrange the meeting with Miriam. I'm going to get her confession." Sloane's reply came almost immediately. "The recorder is ready. Gideon will be waiting outside the estate. Be careful." Celeste read the message and felt a strange calm spread through her. She would face Miriam. She would force her to admit everything, and she would save Drew, save the child growing inside her, and save herself. The following afternoon, Celeste drove to the estate alone. She didn't tell Knox, and she didn't tell anyone except Sloane and Gideon. The small recorder was hidden carefully inside the lining of her bra, the one place she knew for certain no one would check. Her heart was pounding as though it wanted to leap out of her chest, but her steps were steady as she walked through the iron gates engraved with the black eagle. Miriam received her in the study, the room with dark oak-paneled walls and wide windows overlooking the sprawling garden. She was seated behind a mahogany desk, dressed in black as though she had been waiting for this moment. When Celeste stepped inside, Miriam looked up, and a cold smile spread across her lips. She said that Celeste had come alone. How brave. Celeste didn't answer. She walked straight to the desk and placed a thick envelope on top of it. Inside was everything she had. The lab results showing the vitamins contained harmful substances. The video of Bridget calling Miriam to report on her. The records of Dr. Harmon's dark past. She spoke in a voice calmer than she had expected, saying that she knew everything Miriam had done. Miriam didn't flinch. She leafed through the papers with an air of indifference, as though she were reading a restaurant menu. Then she looked up and laughed, a soft and terrifying laugh. She asked what Celeste planned to do with all this. Hand it to Knox. She tilted her head, her eyes sharp as blades cutting into Celeste. She said that Celeste thought Knox would believe whom? An orphan from a children's home diagnosed by a doctor with psychological instability, or the mother who had raised him for 33 years. Miriam rose and walked toward Celeste, each step firm and echoing across the wooden floor. She said Celeste had nothing, that she was only a weed trying to take root in someone else's flower garden. Celeste swallowed and said the two words she knew would make Miriam lose control. Was Vanessa a weed too? Miriam stopped. The smile disappeared from her lips, and her eyes sharpened like knives. She asked in a dangerous voice what Celeste knew about Vanessa. Celeste fought to keep her own voice steady even though her heart was pounding wildly. She said that she knew Vanessa had been pregnant, that she had vanished, and that she wanted to know what Miriam had done to her. Miriam was silent for a long moment, studying Celeste with a measured look. Then she stepped closer, close enough for Celeste to smell her expensive perfume, and said in a whisper like the hiss of a snake that Celeste wanted to know why she hated her, and that it wasn't because she was poor, but because she was like Vanessa. The same meaningless, defiant eyes, the same stubbornness that didn't know when to stop. Celeste asked again where Vanessa had gone. Miriam smiled, and the smile was cold to the bone. She said that Vanessa had disappeared, just like everyone else who dared stand in her way. Celeste didn't back down. She asked again what Miriam had done to Vanessa. Miriam tilted her head, and something almost like pride lit her eyes. She said that she never dirtied her own hands. She only arranged things. Just as she had arranged for Drew to be transferred to the appropriate medical facility. Just as she would arrange things for Celeste if she didn't cooperate. Celeste felt fury rising in her chest, but she forced it down. She needed more. She said she wouldn't sign the divorce papers, that she wouldn't disappear. Miriam didn't get angry. She only gave a slight shrug and said in a calm voice, more frightening than shouting, that in that case, Drew would never receive surgery. Then she turned back toward the desk and picked up a small object, a silver lighter engraved with an intricate eagle design. She flicked it open, and the tiny flame danced in the reflection of her cold eyes. Miriam looked at Celeste through that flame and said that if she didn't cooperate, she would be given a reminder so she would never forget who she was. Celeste stared at the little flame dancing at the tip of the lighter, and she knew Miriam wasn't joking. Miriam Ashford had made people disappear before. She was willing to do anything to protect the Ashford bloodline she believed was pure. But Celeste knew something else too. The recorder hidden inside her clothing was still running. She had enough evidence now. Every confession Miriam had made about arranging for people to disappear, about Drew, about the threats, all of it had been captured. She only needed to get out of there. Celeste stepped backward toward the door, trying to keep her distance from Miriam and the flame in her hand. But Miriam had no intention of letting her leave so easily. Knox Ashford stood in the doorway, his gray eyes frozen as if turned to stone. He stared at the scene before him, unable to believe what he was seeing. His mother was holding the silver lighter, its metal tip still glowing red. His wife had been driven into the corner, and on her pale skin, a raw red wound marked her wrist. In 33 years of life, Knox had never seen his mother like this. He had heard the rumors, had ignored Gideon's warnings, had believed that no matter how harsh his mother could be, she still loved him. But now the evidence was right in front of him, undeniable, impossible to excuse, impossible to explain away. Miriam released Celeste and turned to face her son. Her expression shifted from fury to shock in an instant. She began stammering that he didn't understand, that she was protecting the family, that this girl would destroy everything they had built. She spoke of Ashford blood, of family honor, of all the things she had sacrificed to preserve. Knox cut her off with a single word: silence. One word, not loud, not shouted, yet it thundered through the room like a storm breaking overhead. Miriam froze. Her mouth stayed open, but no sound came out. For the first time in her life, her son had told her to be silent. For the first time, she saw in Knox's gray eyes not respect or love, but disgust. Knox stepped toward Celeste, his hands trembling when he touched the wound on her wrist. He looked into his wife's eyes, and in that moment, every doubt Miriam had planted in his mind vanished. He saw the truth. He saw the pain. He saw the woman who had loved him without condition, the woman his own mother had tormented for months. Then Knox turned back to Miriam, his gray eyes colder than a Chicago winter. He pulled out his phone and dialed without taking his gaze off his mother. His voice was level and cold when he spoke 2 words into the phone. Gideon. Protocol 0. Right now. The air in the room turned to ice. Miriam's face drained of color as the weight of those words hit her. Protocol 0 wasn't just a punishment. It was a digital and social execution. Within seconds, every bank account tied to her name would be frozen, every security clearance revoked, and every loyal soldier in the Ashford Empire would treat her as a ghost. Knox wasn't just disowning her, he was erasing her existence from the world she helped build. Miriam went pale. She knew exactly what Protocol 0 meant. It was the procedure reserved for the highest level of traitors inside the Ashford Empire, the process that froze assets, revoked all access, and imposed total isolation. She began stammering that he couldn't do this to his own mother, that she was his mother, that she had given birth to him and raised him for 33 years. Knox looked at her one last time, and when he spoke, his voice held no emotion at all. He said Protocol 0 had been designed for traitors, and today, for the first time in Ashford family history, it would be used on his own mother. Knox wrapped Celeste in his arms and led her out of the room. Before crossing the threshold, he stopped and turned back to look at Miriam one final time. He said that for 33 years he had called her mother, but from this moment on, she was nothing to him anymore. The door closed, and Miriam stood alone in the study. For the first time in her life, she had completely lost control. Protocol 0 wasn't just a threat. It was a sentence, and it had already been signed. Knox took Celeste straight to the hospital the moment they left the estate. He didn't say much on the drive there. He only held her hand tightly, as though he feared she would disappear if he let go. The wound on Celeste's wrist was treated quickly by the doctors. It wasn't too deep, but it would leave a scar. Knox stood beside her through the entire process, his gray eyes never leaving her for even a second, his face tightening every time he looked at the bright red burn against the pale skin of his wife. Meanwhile, Sloane and Gideon were moving elsewhere. The instant Gideon received the Protocol 0 order from Knox, he activated the network he had built over many years. Sloane had been tracking the communications line of Marcus, Miriam's closest enforcer, and she discovered the address of the medical facility where Drew was being held. It was a private clinic on the outskirts of Chicago, a place Miriam often used to handle problems she didn't want anyone else to know about. Gideon went there with the Ashford family lawyer and 2 police officers. Drew Morgan was a 22-year-old legal adult, and transferring him to another facility without his consent or the consent of his legal guardian was illegal. It didn't matter that the Ashford Charity Foundation was funding his treatment. It didn't matter how much power Miriam Ashford possessed. The law was still the law. Within 3 hours, Drew was returned to the official hospital, the same hospital where Celeste was being treated. When Celeste heard that Drew was safe, she rose from the hospital bed even as the nurses tried to stop her. She ran down the hallway, her 6-month pregnant belly swaying, until she found her brother's room. Drew was sitting up in bed, thinner than the last time she had seen him, but his eyes lit up the moment he saw her. Celeste rushed into his arms, and he held her so tightly she could hardly breathe. Drew said in a trembling voice that he knew she would come, that he hadn't been afraid. Celeste cried. For the first time in a very long while, she wasn't crying from pain or fear, but from happiness. Her brother was safe. The child inside her was safe. The nightmare was finally beginning to end. Knox stood in the doorway of the hospital room, watching the brother and sister holding each other. He didn't step inside, as though he felt he didn't deserve to be part of that moment. When Celeste turned and saw him, she wiped away her tears and said thank you. Knox shook his head and stepped into the room. He said she shouldn't thank him, that he should have seen the truth sooner. He should have protected her instead of letting his mother hurt her for all those months. Celeste looked into Knox's eyes and saw something she had never seen before. The gray eyes of the most powerful Mafia boss in Chicago were rimmed with red. For the first time, Celeste saw Knox Ashford cry. Knox said in a choked voice that he had let his mother hurt her, that he had doubted her when she had needed his trust the most. He said he was sorry, and those 2 words carried more weight than anything he had ever said before. Celeste stepped toward him and placed her hand against his cheek, wiping away the tear sliding down his face. She said that he was here now, and that was what mattered. Knox took her hand and pressed it to his lips. He said he would tear down everything Miriam had built, that she would pay for every tear Celeste had shed, for every night she had lived in fear, for every moment she had felt alone inside that lavish penthouse. And Knox Ashford was a man who kept his promises. Protocol Zero was fully activated within 30 minutes of the moment Knox called Gideon. Every one of Miriam's bank accounts was frozen, from her personal accounts to the shadow funds she thought no one knew existed. Her access to every Ashford family business was revoked, keycards invalidated, codes changed, fingerprints erased from the system. Miriam Ashford, the woman who had once controlled half of Chicago, was suddenly reduced to someone with nothing. She was completely isolated, trapped inside the estate like a prisoner in her own mansion. Knox opened a full-scale investigation. He hired the best private investigators, forensic financial experts, and lawyers willing to dig into every dark corner of the empire his mother had built. Every secret Miriam had buried over the past 20 years was dragged into the light. Suspicious transactions, money transferred to names no one recognized, files that had been deleted but could still be restored. Celeste's recording became the most important piece of evidence. Miriam's voice rang out clearly through the speakers, admitting that she had arranged for people to disappear, threatening Celeste and Drew, speaking with pride about the way she removed anyone who stood in her way. Marcus Holt, Miriam's most trusted enforcer for 20 years, began talking once he was backed into a corner. He knew the ship was sinking, and he had no intention of going down with it. He told everything, every detail, every order, every filthy act he had carried out at Miriam's command. And then Gideon reopened the old file, the one about Vanessa. The truth emerged like a nightmare. Vanessa hadn't run away with another man the way Miriam had told Knox. Marcus had arranged for her to disappear on Miriam's orders. She had been 3 months pregnant when it happened. Knox could have had a child 5 years earlier. Knox read the file alone in his office. Celeste stood outside the door, looking through the narrow opening, and saw her husband's shoulders trembling. His hand held the papers, but he wasn't reading anymore. He was only staring at Vanessa's photograph, clipped to the file. A young woman with brown hair and a radiant smile, someone who had loved Knox and trusted him to protect her. Celeste walked in and sat down beside Knox. He didn't look at her. He kept staring at the photograph. His voice was hoarse when he said that 5 years ago, he had believed his mother when she told him Vanessa had betrayed him. He hadn't searched. He hadn't investigated. He hadn't asked questions. He had let her disappear because he believed his mother. Celeste took Knox's hand and said that he hadn't known, that he couldn't have known. Knox shook his head, his eyes bloodshot, though no tears fell. He said he should have known, should have protected Vanessa, just as he had almost failed to protect Celeste. He had blindly trusted his mother while she was destroying the lives of the people he loved. Knox turned to look at Celeste, his deep gray eyes filled with a pain he couldn't hide. He said that this time would be different. Miriam would pay, not only for Celeste, but for Vanessa too, for the unborn child who never had the chance to enter the world, for every person his mother had ruined through all those years. Celeste wrapped her arms around Knox, and he leaned into her as though she were the only thing keeping him from falling apart completely. Knox now had all the evidence he needed. There was only one thing left to do: bring Miriam into the light in a way she would never forget. Miriam thought her status would protect her, that Knox would never dare act publicly. 2 weeks later, she attended the annual charity gala, unaware that the evidence had already been handed to the police. 300 of the most powerful figures in Chicago were gathered in the glittering grand ballroom of a 5-star hotel, from senior politicians to billionaire businessmen, from entertainment stars to media tycoons. This was the event Chicago high society waited for all year, the place where they displayed their wealth beneath the respectable mask of charity. Miriam Ashford stood on the stage, radiant in her familiar Bordeaux gown and the black pearl necklace at her throat. She didn't know that this would be the last time she ever stood before this crowd as the queen of Chicago society. She smiled and began her speech, her voice echoing through the sound system as she spoke of love, of family, of the way the Ashford family had always placed noble values above all else. Applause rose through the room, polite and even. Fake smiles, approving nods. No one knew that the woman speaking of love on that stage had once used a lighter to burn her pregnant daughter-in-law. Then the ballroom doors opened, not gently, like the arrival of a late guest. They flew open, hard and absolute. Every head turned toward the entrance, and whispers began to spread across the hall. The police entered, a team of 5 in immaculate uniform, led by an inspector with a severe face, and directly behind them walked Knox Ashford, his face cold as ice, his gray eyes empty of all emotion. Miriam stopped in the middle of a sentence, the microphone still in her hand. She looked at her son, looked at the police officers, and for the first time in her life, fear flickered in her eyes. But she recovered quickly, still keeping that smile on her lips as though this were only some minor inconvenience. The inspector stepped onto the stage, each footstep ringing through the deathly silence of the ballroom. He stopped in front of Miriam and read the arrest warrant in a voice loud and clear. Miriam Ashford, you are under arrest on charges including conspiracy to cause grievous bodily harm, intentional harm, and involvement in the disappearances of multiple individuals. Gasps rippled through the ballroom. Camera flashes exploded over and over, the media capturing every second like vultures circling fresh death. Miriam was handcuffed right there on the stage, in front of the 300 most powerful people in Chicago, the very people she had spent her life trying to impress and control. Miriam turned to look at Knox, and her eyes blazed with hatred. Through clenched teeth, she hissed that he would regret this. Knox stepped onto the stage and faced his mother one last time. He stood there tall and unshaken, and asked whether she knew what he had learned from her. Miriam said nothing, her jaw locked tight. Knox said he had learned that family wasn't blood, but the people one chose to protect. And today, he was choosing to protect his wife from her. 300 pairs of eyes stared without blinking. 300 mouths hung open. 300 minds struggled to process what they had just witnessed. Miriam Ashford, the queen of Chicago society, was being led away in handcuffs like any ordinary criminal. The empire she had built over 30 years collapsed in 30 minutes. Miriam was escorted through the ballroom, past rows of guests who watched her with expressions of shock and hungry curiosity. No one stepped forward to defend her. No one said a word. She walked alone, just as she had lived her life. Only this time she no longer had the power to make others fear her. Celeste stood in the corner of the ballroom, with one hand resting on her now prominent pregnant belly. Sloane stood beside her, and Drew sat in a wheelchair just behind them, discharged from the hospital only that morning so he could witness this moment. Celeste watched Miriam being taken away, the woman who had once wanted to destroy her, who had wanted to kill the child inside her, now being led off in handcuffs like a criminal. She felt no triumph. She felt no satisfaction. She only felt relief, as though a stone weighing 1,000 pounds had finally been lifted from her chest. Sometimes justice came slowly, but it still came, Miriam Ashford's trial lasted 3 weeks and became the most closely watched case in Chicago that year. The press covered it relentlessly with sensational headlines about the fall of the Ashford empire, about the powerful mother-in-law turned criminal defendant, about the dark secrets hidden behind the doors of high society. Reporters crowded the courthouse gates every day. Cameras pointed at anyone connected to the case. The evidence presented in court was impossible to deny. The recording of Miriam's confession to Celeste was played aloud, her voice echoing through the courtroom as she admitted to arranging for people to disappear and threatening Celeste and Drew. The video of Bridget reporting to Miriam about changing the dosage under her instructions was shown on the large screen. And most important of all was the testimony of Marcus Holt, who had worked for Miriam for 20 years. In exchange for a reduced sentence, he told everything, every filthy act he had carried out under her orders, including the arrangement that made Vanessa disappear 5 years earlier. Celeste was the final witness called to the stand. She walked slowly, her pregnant belly now close to full term. Knox sat in the front row, his eyes never leaving her for even a second. Celeste stood before the court and told everything, from the poisoned vitamins to the 3 o'clock in the morning incident with Bridget, from Drew being transferred away to that final moment in Miriam's study. Then she pulled up her sleeve, revealing the scar still marked in red across her wrist. She said in a voice calm yet carrying through the entire courtroom that this was what Miriam Ashford had done to her own daughter-in-law, an orphan girl 6 months pregnant. The courtroom fell into silence. Not a whisper, not a cough, only the heavy silence of hundreds of people confronted with cruelty beyond imagination. The verdict came on the final day of the trial. Miriam Ashford was sentenced to 25 years in prison for conspiracy to cause grievous bodily harm, intentional endangerment, and psychological torture, and involvement in Vanessa's disappearance. When the judge read the sentence, Miriam stood motionless, her face showing no emotion. Then she turned to look at Knox one last time. There was no remorse in her eyes, no tears, no apology, only pure hatred, as though she still believed she had done nothing wrong. Knox looked back at his mother, his expression unchanged. It was the last time they ever looked at one another as mother and son. Miriam was led away through the side door, the handcuffs still around her wrists, her head held high as though she were still a queen. The courtroom door closed behind her, and a new chapter began. 3 months after the trial, Celeste lay in the delivery room, her hand gripping Knox's as though he were the only anchor she had in the middle of the pain tearing through her body. Knox stayed by her side through the entire process, not leaving for even a second, despite the nurses suggesting several times that he wait outside. The most powerful Mafia boss in Chicago was now nothing more than a worried husband, his face even paler than his wife's. Then the first cry rang out, a tiny cry, but strong, shattering the tense silence of the delivery room. The doctor placed the baby on Celeste's chest, and she looked down at the small life wriggling in her arms. A son. Healthy. Perfect. Celeste burst into tears, streams of happiness running down her cheeks. She turned to Knox and saw something she had never seen before. The gray eyes of the powerful boss were red with emotion, and tears were falling. Not tears of pain like the night he read Vanessa's file, but tears of pure joy. For the first time in his life, Knox Ashford was crying because he was happy. He bent down and kissed Celeste's forehead, then looked at their tiny son with an expression full of awe, as though he couldn't believe this was real. Celeste said in a tired but happy voice that she wanted to name him Asher, meaning blessed and fortunate. Knox lifted his head and looked at her, asking whether she didn't want to follow Ashford family tradition. Celeste shook her head and said that their son was a new beginning, that he didn't need to carry the burden of the past. Knox was quiet for a moment, then smiled, the first smile with no darkness hiding behind it. He said, Asher Ashford, and that he liked it. The hospital room door opened, and Drew walked in. He had undergone successful heart surgery 2 months earlier, and was recovering well, though he was still a little thin and pale. But his eyes shone brightly when he saw the tiny baby in his sister's arms. Drew exclaimed that he had become an uncle, his voice breaking with emotion. He came to the bedside and looked at Asher with eyes full of wonder. He whispered hello to his nephew, saying, Uncle Drew is here, and I promise I'll always be by your side. Celeste looked at her brother, and the memory of everything they had survived came rushing back like a flood. 2 orphan children in the cold Detroit children's home, a bowl of seafood soup made from leftover ingredients, hungry nights and days with no one to protect them. And now that frail 7-year-old boy had become a 24-year-old young man looking at his nephew with love shining in his eyes. Sloane and Gideon came to visit too. bringing flowers and gifts. The hospital room suddenly became warm with laughter and blessings. Celeste looked around, at all the faces surrounding her. Knox, Drew, Sloane, Gideon. No one shared her blood except Asher, but all of them had chosen to be here, chosen to love her, chosen to become her family. Celeste whispered that this was what a real family truly was. Asher slept in his mother's arms, his tiny hand wrapped tightly around Knox's finger. Knox stood beside them, one hand resting on Celeste's shoulder, looking at his wife and son with an expression full of reverence. For the first time in her life, the orphan girl from the Detroit Children's Home had a family she could finally call home. 1 year later, everyone's life had changed completely. Drew had undergone successful heart surgery and was recovering better than anyone had dared hope. Knox officially accepted him as a younger brother in the Ashford family, not through paperwork or legal procedure, but through genuine love. Drew was studying to become a social worker, and whenever someone asked him why, he only smiled and said that he wanted to help people like his sister and himself from back then. Sloane had completely abandoned the spoiled heiress mask she had worn for 5 long years. Now she was the chief financial officer of Ashford Holdings, running the company with a sharpness no one would ever have expected from the girl who had once seemed to care only about shopping and parties. Whenever anyone asked about those years of pretending, she only laughed and said they had been worth every second. Knox made the boldest decision in Ashford family history. He walked away from every illegal branch of the empire and kept only the legitimate businesses. Many people said he was insane, said he was destroying the legacy of his ancestors, but Knox didn't care. He said that Ashford would no longer be a name that made people afraid, but a name that made people feel respect. And Celeste, the orphan girl from the Detroit Children's Home, had now fulfilled her dream. Phoenix Kitchen, a free cooking center for young people from orphanages, officially opened its doors. Every day, Celeste stood in that warm kitchen, teaching children like the girl she had once been how to create delicious meals from the simplest ingredients. The scar on her wrist was still there, and she never tried to hide it. She said it was proof that she had survived. That night, on the penthouse balcony overlooking the glittering lights of Chicago, Celeste stood beside Knox. Inside, 1-year-old Asher was sleeping peacefully in his crib. Drew sat on the sofa reading a book, while Sloane sat beside him, teasing him like a real sister. Laughter echoed through the apartment that had once been cold and full of shadows. Knox said his family had once been a prison. Celeste looked inside, at the faces laughing together, and said that real family wasn't blood, but the people who chose to stay by one another's side. Knox wrapped his arms around her from behind and whispered that for the first time in his life, this home truly had laughter in it. And somewhere inside a prison, Miriam Ashford sat alone in a cold cell. She had lost everything: her son, her empire, her power, and even the honor she had valued more than life itself. She had lost it all because she forgot the simplest truth of all. Blood didn't make a family, love did, and she had never truly loved anyone except herself. If this story touched your heart, please press the like button to support us. Please share this video with those who need to hear the message that real family isn't blood, but the people who choose to stand beside you in the darkness. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next stories, where justice always finds its way to the hearts brave enough to endure. How did this story make you feel? Please leave a comment below so we can hear what rises from the deepest part of your heart. We truly look forward to reading your thoughts. Wishing everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in every single day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.